Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California, and as always, I am joined by
Zanko in Ohio.
And we have a special episode today. I feel like they're all special episodes at this point, but this is a very special episode. We actually have just passed the 60th anniversary of the beginning of the coup in Indonesia, which I believe happened on October 1st. And we didn't want this to pass without having an episode on it and having a conversation about it. And so today we're joined by our good friend, Dr. Clinton Fernandes, who is an Australian historian and scholar and professor of international and political studies at the University of New South Wales in Canberra. Also the author of a new book called Turbulence, Australian Foreign Policy in the Trump Era. But we're going to be talking about Indonesia today with this the anniversary. Clinton, welcome to the Green and Red podcast. Welcome
back.
Good
to be with you.
Welcome back.
Oh, thank you. Good to be with you. We have yet to meet, Scott.
Yes, we'll meet in person one day, I'm sure. So we're going to just kick off talking about Indonesia in 1965 and what led up to it. Could you actually, maybe we can just kick off a little bit with the nature of the Indonesian political system under Sukarno after the end of Dutch colonial rule?
Sure. There's a kind of a background before the events of 1965, and without that little bit of a background, the events themselves don't make much sense. Indonesia was a Dutch colony called the Netherlands East Indies. There wasn't any country called Indonesia. It was created by the archipelagic nature of the Dutch colonial presence in what used to be called the Malay archipelago. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was followed very soon by the land attack down the Southeast Asia, at which point Japan basically conquered the Dutch East Indies from the Netherlands, and they surrendered. There were two general moves at the time. There were Indonesian nationalists who supported the Japanese occupation as part of a broader liberatory vision that one day they would be independent themselves. And then there were other Indonesian nationalists who opposed the Japanese occupation, but they were absolutely committed to Indonesia's independence in the long term anyway. The atmosphere at the time, from the 1920s all the way even into the late 1950s, was that there wasn't actually a contradiction between being a Muslim or a nationalist or a socialist or a communist. It was all regarded as part of the broader streams into which you could be an Indonesian patriot or Indonesian nationalist. The Communist Party of Indonesia was founded in 1920. It was the first communist party in Asia, certainly in Southeast Asia. And it was regarded as quite normal that you could be a Muslim, including a member of Muslim political currents, and be a communist. The Communist Party of Indonesia was not a revolutionary party. It had the name, the Indonesian Communist Party. It was not a revolutionary party that sought to overthrow any arrangement, even after independence. Rather, it was an organization that was committed to defending the interests of the poor within the system. The Indonesian Communist Party had no armed wing. They were committed to a parliamentary path to government or to politics. They actually had no militia groups, auxiliaries, anything like that. Unlike, say, the Chinese Communist Party, or some other communist party you can think of, Vietnam, for example, it never tried to seize power by force. Okay, so that's one of the backgrounds. There was, however, a tension between the Indonesian Communist Party and some of the others in the Indonesian nationalist movement, which culminated in an uprising in 1948. So when Japan surrendered in 1945, you've got the Dutch trying to come back and take back their colony. Many things were going on at the time. But the communists in a place called Madiun, Madrun, in central Java, they had an uprising there. It was quite a bit of an insurrection. And the reason is they were opposed to any form of Indonesian independence, which would have kept Indonesia as a colony in everything except having a flag and some political symbols. And there was a tension there, as a result of which the nationalist leadership believed that the communist challenge was a bit of a betrayal at the time, a kind of treachery at the time when they were fighting the Dutch. And so there was a crackdown, and a number of communists, a few thousand, were eventually killed in Madiun. So that set the first thing up as a point of tension between the Indonesian Communist Party and the Indonesian nationalist leadership, as well as the Indonesian army, which was assigned to do the crackdown. But Indonesia, when it did become independent, it was a very influential country strategically. It's located along the equator, in between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. Deep submarine access, for deep trench access under the sea for submarines to go through. At the moment, I think it's got 280 million people. But even back then, it was the fourth most populous country in the world. And it was the largest Muslim majority country in the world. Its leader, Sukarno, was a charismatic figure. And he became part of the wave of post-independence global South third world leaders, including Nehru, later on Nasser, Tito of Yugoslavia, Nasser of Egypt, of course. And there were a number of people like that, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, a lot of those people. No strangers to Green and Red's audience, given that you are an internationalist show. And all of this was quite threatening, because the whole point of having an empire was that you would control the sovereignty of other countries. And so if you were trying to actually get real independence, economic independence, not just political independence, you were a threat. One of the things that occurred in the 1950s was the United States realized that this idea of third world nationalism, independent economic nationalism, even though it wasn't communism, it might as well have been communism, because it would have taken the resources that had previously been available to the colonial power and redeployed them in the interest of the people who actually lived in that archipelago in Indonesia. And so the Eisenhower administration, along with the Dulles brothers, worked with the Australians, in particular, the foreign minister at the time of my country, Richard Casey, to try and find fault lines in Indonesia and destabilize it. And one of them was the fault line between the central island of Java, which is the most populous island in the world. It's got half the population of Indonesia, which today has 280 million people. So the fault line between the people in Java and the people in the outer islands, not all of whom were Muslims, some of them were Christians, but the generals on those outer islands were quite anti-communist, because they were connected to the landowning classes, the plantation owners. And any talk about getting a better deal for the interests of the workers on those plantations or land reform might as well have been communism as far as they were concerned. And so the United States fomented what's called the Outer Islands Rebellion. They tried to either break Indonesia up, or if they couldn't do that, to destabilize it so much that it would be so consumed with its internal problems that it wouldn't have the ability to project its soft power, its inspirational talk, and so on, around the rest of the third world, the developing world. So that Outer Islands Rebellion was quite a big deal. There was bombings of the Caltex oil facilities. There were mercenaries that were involved, people from Taiwan. And finally, an American pilot who was flying in without being declared as an American pilot was shot down. At which point it became clear that to the rest of the world, that in fact it wasn't some indigenous uprising completely spontaneous, but rather it was fermented by external powers that had exploited those fault lines. And so that pilot, when he was shot down, gave the game away. And the United States then realized that it would have to rethink things. But it understood by 1957-58 that not only was the Indonesian army strong enough to put down that uprising, but that the Indonesian army was anti-communist, or was anti-worker. And so they realized that they had actually been backing one branch of the anti-communist Indonesian army against another branch of the anti-communist Indonesian army in the outer islands. So they decided, forget about that, let's just increase our aid to the Indonesian army as a whole, and we'll bide our time. And that's what they did. So with that long run-up, you got these two major events. 1948, an uprising in central Java, which pits the army against the Indonesian Communist Party. 1958, where the Indonesian army crushes an uprising that's fomented by the United States. And those fault lines are such that if you've got this major uprising where foreign forces trying to break up your country, it increases the level of internal repression because you want to make sure that you are secure. The result was that the 1958 elections were cancelled. And that was really the end of an open, freewheeling democracy. It then makes it easier. Once you increase the level of external pressure, you increase the level of internal repression as a result. And then you can accuse the country that's increased the level of internal repression in the face of your pressure as authoritarian. And so that's a pattern that you see everywhere. And it's even happening now. You want to make Iran or North Korea more repressive, increase the external pressure, it'll become internally more repressive, and you can then accuse it of being repressive, authoritarian, and so on. So that was the idea. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Like two kind of, just to go back a little bit, what's the role of the PKI in the resistance in the underground during World War II?
Sure. Okay, so the PKI, the Partai Komunis Indonesia, that's the Indonesian Communist Party, is the PKI. They were quite important in the independence struggle, not unlike communist parties in many other places around the world, including in Southeast Asia, but also in Italy and Greece, France, Albania, places like that. They were an indigenous force of patriots who just happened to think that their country ought to be organized around certain lines. But there were others who were not communists, and they were nationalists, and they were also important in the independence struggle. So the Communist Party was not regarded as a hostile external force. It was part of the Indonesian nationalist movement, but there was actually an Indonesian nationalist party as well. Okay, and the left wing of the Indonesian Nationalist Party was quite sympathetic to the Communist Party of Indonesia. But the Communist Party of Indonesia, I would say, is not the same, did not play the same dominant, exclusive role that the Italian communists did in the anti-fascist resistance in Italy. Whereas the Italian resistance, before any Western forces had arrived, external forces, they'd held down 6 German divisions. That isn't what that level of resistance, because Indonesia is an archipelago. In Italy, if you're conducting an anti-fascist guerrilla war, you're using the land. In an archipelago, it becomes a bit difficult. So there's a lot of... Indonesia was a nation in waiting, they used to say. It hadn't existed yet, because the word Indonesia just means Indian Islands or Little India. And it's an external word. There are some Indonesians who believe that the real name for their country ought to be Nusantara, which is an Indonesian word meaning archipelago. Anyway, so that's the background. So the Indonesian Communist Party was an important part of the resistance, but there were others. There were gangsters. There were gangsters and revolutionaries that were all part of the nationalist movement in Indonesia. Now, 1960s, the Indonesian Communist Party...
Can we go back one more more thing? Because Sukarno, I think, is an important figure, not just in the context that you mentioned, but really globally.
Absolutely.
Because you do have that kind of a non-aligned movement. And the major conference is Bandung, right?
Yeah, the Asia-Africa Conference, 1955. Right. Yeah, the originator of that.
So the U.S. sees him like Nasser, right, as a threat bigger than simply the leader of this nation that has resources, and that may be. But this is a bad example for the world, right?
It's a very bad example if you're in a part of imperial planning, because Sukarno is mobilizing forces, popular forces, not just in Indonesia, but he's inspiring other former colonies along lines that allow them to preserve their own resources for the benefit of their own people. And so, that's quite threatening. But Sukarno was not a Ho Chi Minh.
No, although for the U.S.'s purposes, he might as well have been, because the U.S. would view that in 50s documents. You would see that laundry list, and it would include Ho Chi Minh and Sukarno and everybody else, Mao and Stalin, and you just lump them all together.
Yeah. The Indonesian Communist Party was led in 1951, by a man called D.N. Aidit. He actually created the first 2 names. Indonesians are often mononomial. In other words, they only have one name. Okay? I have 2 names, Clinton Fernandes, but Suharto is just Suharto. Aidit is just Aidit. But he called himself D.N., but he was in the Communist Party. Now, the Communist Party was in a way trying to push Sukarno to the left. The army was trying to pull Sukarno to the right. But he had enough respect and trust among millions of Indonesians that he was able to balance these forces, the army on the one side and the Indonesian Communist Party on the other, as well as the Nationalist Party. And it was basically, he was able to balance them in the public's mind by not just by playing one off against the other. It's just that he was a unifying figure, and they were both trying to drag Sukarno and Indonesia to the left or to the right. The Indonesian Communist Party did not believe in developing its own militias. Rather, it felt it could work with sympathetic people in the Indonesian Defense Forces to advance their aims. And this is really at the heart of what occurred in 1965 in the coup. Anyway, 1960s, and in the wake of the Outer Islands Rebellion, the success of the army, the defeat of the United States and Australia in trying to break up Indonesia, it increased the level of tension inside the countries. And so you've got the communists who are organizing in the plantations, not just in Java, but including in the eastern part and the western part of the Indonesian archipelago on the plantations. But they are primarily organizing among Javanese workers. It wasn't exclusively Javanese, but it was almost entirely Javanese. It found its greatest resonance among plantation workers because it was talking about land reform. So obviously, if you and your family and your ancestors have been working a plantation for centuries, and you're still working as almost like a serf, you find the idea of land reform quite appealing. Moreover, Indonesia had actually passed laws about land reform, not as much as the communists would have wanted, but they passed laws. But because of the power of the established conservative landowning elite, it was felt that they weren't really enforcing the laws. So what the Communist Party was doing was trying to enter these plantations to compel the landlords to comply with existing law. They were not overthrowing the system. They were trying to advance the interests of the poor within the system. That's the key thing to understand. They were not a revolutionary party that was beholden to Mao or the Soviet Union or anything like that. They were not in any way like the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, basically. They were an Indonesian party. What's missing, because of what I'm going to talk about in a second, their destruction, because of all that and the suppression of studies about them, we don't have much research yet about the daily lives of those people. For example, in your country, there's a book by Vivian Gornick about the American Communist Party. And you learn from that book things that are the social life, the fact that there were dance halls, there were properties in the Catskill Mountains that people could go to, there was education classes, so there was actually a full way of life. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. We know
baseball
almost
teams.
Nothing. Bob and Scott, you guys know about this. So there isn't any research yet about the lives of the communists or the rank and file in that way, in the way of Vivian Gornick's book of what was it like to have a social life, to have excursions, education. All of that's gone because it was all destroyed and suppressed. All right. So the communists begin to do these land reform actions in order to get the landowners to comply with existing law. And because there's it's Indonesia, there's a large Muslim population. One way you can try to weaken that is by portraying the communists as hostile to Islam. And for the first decade and so on, it didn't really work. In fact, for the first 3 decades, from the 1920s, when the communists was established, it didn't work because they were regarded as, for many people in the Islamic parties, being a communist was part of what it meant to be a Muslim, because you were fighting for justice. You were fighting against usury and land and interest rates that are high and all landlordism and all of those things. It wasn't regarded as a problem. But with enough tension, propaganda, lack of education, it's easier then to mobilize for the conservative landlords and their propaganda outfits to mobilize ordinary Muslims against the communists and to portray them as somehow people who are going to eliminate Islam, there's a threat to you, all of those things. Now, in this heightened tension, the communists were then lured by the Indonesian army into trying to do what they call a retooling of the army apparatus. So what the communists were trying to do is get the military to not be so opposed to them and to get behind a more left-wing populist type of program. It was absolutely not a coup on their part. Right? It was rather an internal move, which I'll explain in a second. But the communists were incompetent at precisely the kind of maneuvers and politicking that they were trying to do. They were very good at...
Is this the September 30th movement we're talking about?
Yeah. So what happened was they were led to believe, this is in 1965, right? So 1963, 64, you've got these land reform actions entering the plantations to try and get land reform happening. 1965, there's a lot of tension. There's a few things happen. Two most important things. In August of 1965, Sukarno, the president, is meeting with the leader of another political party, and he vomits and passes out in that meeting. And that brings to people's mind, oh my goodness, this guy who is a unifying figure, what if he dies at some point soon, or even down the road? We need to make moves to make sure that we are the ones that succeed and not these other people. That's in August. On the 4th or 5th of October is Indonesian Armed Forces Day, 5th of October. And the communists are then led to believe, some of this has not really been discovered because discussion of all these events is still banned in Indonesia. You can't, even today, you can't approach the Indonesian elections as part of an Indonesian Communist Party. It's still not allowed. Right. So what these guys do is they are led to believe in this manipulative environment that a council of right-wing generals is going to seize power on the 5th of October, on Armed Forces Day, because it's Armed Forces Day and you've got all the soldiers who are being trucked in to the capital for the big parade. And so the fear then becomes that as part of them being trucked in by the army for this big parade, they're actually going to take over the country. So you got this fear, and they are led to believe that's about to happen. So the head of the Indonesian Communist Party, the guy I told you about, DNIDIT, AIDIT, he has a special bureau, which is just one or two people. And they are the kind of covert ones who are going to try and make overtures and so on to other parties and other political forces. His name is Sham Kamaruzaman, just call him Sham. He believes that he's got enough small forces to grab some of the generals in this group of people who are about to seize power on Armed Forces Day, arrest them, and then haul them in front of Sukarno himself, and then get Sukarno to replace them with left-wing generals. So it's not an attempt to seize power. They just want different kinds of people in power. Nevertheless, the plot goes wrong. And because it's not a coup, it's an entirely small move, nobody else is prepared. So here's what happens. Believing that there is going to be a coup d'etat on the 5th of October, Armed Forces Day, as the troops are coming in, IDIT then agrees to allow Sham, his special bureau head, take a small group of people, seize these generals, arrest them, and drag them before Sukarno, and then get him fired, and then have a new group come in. The plan goes wrong, and one of the generals is killed. That's the head of the army. Some more are killed, and a lieutenant who's with them. Eventually, all 6 are killed. And nothing more happens. It's not a coup d'etat, so nobody was prepared. The mass organizations of the Indonesian Communist Party had no idea what was going on, and they were the 3rd largest communist party in the world, after the Chinese Communist Party and the Soviet Union's Communist Party. They were the 3rd largest communist party in the world.
What kind of numbers are we talking about? Like
16 million.
In the Communist Party, really?
16 million,
wow.
16. Yeah. And it's affiliated organizations. There were more. There were groups. This is always the issue with the Communist Party. Those in the surviving documents, people who've spoken much later, some of them were. It was a tension between trying to get as many members as possible and trying to get as many cadres who were educated and trained properly. So we're not talking about 16 million mobilized, trained people. Just people who had an affiliation with the Communist Party and who had paid membership fees or who were attending their meetings. But yeah, it was the 3rd largest communist party in the world. Okay, that's the reason why it was feared, because Sukarno was not entirely unsympathetic to them. And a change in Indonesia along those lines would have inspired other 3rd world countries to do something similar. I don't mean go into communism. I just mean some independent economic nationalism, because that's really what the Communist Party was trying to do.
I do have one quick question. When you were talking about land reform and them doing actions around land reform, we're talking about like nonviolent action. We're talking about strikes and boycotts and things like that on plantations.
No, we're talking about mostly that. But when you enter a plantation, and you've got the goons of the landowner there, it's not possible to be non-violent after that, I don't think.
But it's not
this is not Gandhi.
This
is not Gandhi, where people are walking up and getting beaten up and everyone feels morally better.
Yeah, I wasn't really thinking that, but also it's not like an armed group either.
No, but they don't have an army. They don't have any militias. They don't have an armed wing. It's ordinary people who are basically plantation workers, like the people in the next plantation, who are just going across and saying, look, the law says this land reform has to happen. Why haven't you done it? Things like that. It wasn't people showing up on horses with rifles and trying to kill landowners or anything like that.
Yeah.
But they had their own forces, the landowners. And
I was just trying to get a sense of the tools that they use. So.
Sure. Yeah. No, they had nothing like that. Nothing like that. And there are people who believe that the parliamentary road was a mistake. Not in the Communist Party, some of the Western scholars. They believe that they should have had a militia group or something like that. Who knows? I can't second guess these people now. But these guys believe.
Talks about that, doesn't he? John Russo talks about that, doesn't he?
Oh, John Russo is just wonderful. His research is just great. Yeah,
I think he brings that point up, how there was this like large critique that they should have been more militant, and I think Kahan talked about that in the book that was Subversion as Foreign Policy.
Yeah. Look, the judgments are dependent on how you think it ought to have gone. There are counterfactuals, I suppose one could call them, but the reality is that whatever might or should have been done, the Communist Party itself did not do it. They were not an armed force or anything like that. They were a non-revolutionary party advancing the interests of the poor within the system. That's all they were. And so this one guy, Sham, and his deputy, they went and they seized, along with a few people, they went and they seized those generals. The plot went awry, and as a result, those guys were killed. The Indonesian army, led by Major General Suharto, then stepped in, invented stories that the women's groups, the Communist Party had an affiliated organization called WWII, which is like the women's organization. They put out propaganda specifically designed to target the Muslim sensibilities of the Indonesian population, that the corpses of the generals were mutilated by the communists, and that the Indonesian the communist women's organization, WWII, had orgies alongside the mutilation, and parts of the body were cut off and so on. All of that was a lie. Later, autopsy showed none of that had happened. As I said, they were trying to grab these people and hold them before Sukarno. And the plot went wrong. There was resistance and they were killed, but there was no mutilation, anything like that. But what it did was they managed to pit conservative Muslim militias who belonged to the landowners against the Communist Party, which had no militias of their own. And the one thing that the Indonesian army lacked were names of communists and people who were sympathetic to them, because it's a far-flung archipelago. It's along the equator. It's just a whole bunch of islands, 8,000 of them, and they don't have enough intelligence on who to actually pick up and kill. Luckily for them, the United States Embassy and the Australian Embassy had for years been reading the newspapers, collecting names, assembling groups of who are the key people. And so they were able to provide lists and suggestions of where are the cadres, where are the activists, this is how you go and get them. They also provided them with logistical support, with trucks, things that you need in order to go and do the killing. But they were not involved in actually killing anybody. They assisted the Indonesian army. So the killings were quite systematic, and they had a particular pattern to them. For the most part, people were picked up because they were suspected of being communists because of these lists, placed on trucks, taken away to some faraway rural place, an out-of-the-way rural place, and then killed. Their bodies were then trucked to a mass grave, and they were buried there.
Isn't this partially what they refer to as the Jakarta method? Is that
the Jakarta? Yeah, I think that's what the guy called Vincent Bevins talks about.
Yeah,
about Chile. He says that Jakarta is coming or something like that, where signs of that were visible in Chile.
But the Western nations also providing the intel and information on who the people were to go disappear.
I believe so, yeah. But in Chile, though, the names were also known by the Chilean military. Yeah, sure. But yeah, but in Indonesia.
The US had done that in 1963 in Iraq. The US did the same thing. It's very similar, actually, because the Iraqi Communist Party wasn't armed either. and American intelligence operatives were working with the new regime, which included Saddam Hussein as a kind of a minor functionary to flesh out the communists and execute them. Not nearly
Yeah.
at the scope of Indonesia, nowhere near it. We're talking a few hundred, maybe
Yeah.
1,000. Yeah.
Yeah. But in Indonesia, we know from the foreign relations of the United States declassified records that they really had no idea. They didn't have enough intelligence on who the Indonesian Communist Party was.
Yeah.
Because these guys didn't stand out. They were just Indonesians.
Yeah.
And they weren't drilling every Sunday or whatever in the park with makeshift weapons or even sticks or anything like that. They were just ordinary people.
Now, when they go back, I'm sorry about that, but when they ran in elections, did they simply form a coalition with Sukarno, or did they have their own candidates? Or?
They had their own candidates, yeah.
Okay.
They had their own candidates. They were never actually appointed to important cabinet posts by Sukarno. And so any talk about how the communists were ruining the economy and so on isn't true. They were a parliamentary party, basically. They were a parliamentary political party. In a way, you could say that they were like the Communist Party of India, which was not a revolutionary party either. It was what you'd call a social democratic party that had the name of the Communist Party. But it was basically, it ran West Bengal, for example. And there was a Communist Party in India in Kerala. But these were not revolutionary parties. Rather, they were more social democratic parties that were focusing on women's education, primary health for young children, things like that. Now, that's really what they were interested in doing.
Like the Tudeh party in Iran after World War II.
The Tudeh party in Iran, yeah.
Same thing, yeah.
You could compare them in a sense, to the Australian Labor Party, which is currently in power in Australia. It's a social democratic party. And in 1920, when the Indonesian Communist Party was formed, they affiliated to the Comintern because they believed that was like the rising force. But it cannot be understood in Soviet terms or in Russian terms or in Chinese terms. It has to be understood in Indonesian terms.
If you look at their programs, which are easy to find, they're not that dissimilar from like the New Deal. Some of the stuff FDR did. Yeah.
No, not at all. Not at all. They were, like I said, they were the communists. The word communist makes people think about gulags and all of those things.
KGB,
and
the KGB.
Camps. Yeah. And these guys were absolutely amateurish. The one move they made failed because there were just a few people doing it. And so anyway, the point is, once the Indonesian armed forces led by Suharto took over and cracked down on the communists, they were assisted at all times by Indonesian Muslim militias that had been mobilized under the weight of the propaganda that these people were devilish. They were conducting sexual orgies whilst mutilating generals. And the result of the killings was that at least 500,000 members of the Indonesian Communist Party were killed. The figure is regarded as outrageously low. A key general, towards the end of his life, his name was Sarwo Edi, Edhie, Sarwo, Sarwo, Edi, Edhie, Wibowo, stated that the figure was 3 million. Okay. And he was one of the guys who was leading the anti-communist killings. Towards the end of his life, about 30 years later, he said, we killed 3 million communists. It wasn't like a deathbed confession. He just said, this is how many we killed. Right? But the result of it was a complete suppression of progressive trends inside Indonesia. I'm not sure if you want to talk about the nature of the massacres themselves, or would you like me to talk about the effect of the massacres culturally, politically? What would you like to go with?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
You go ahead. I did have one question about one region that actually I just want to like lift up, which I understand where some of the worst massacres happen, which is Bali, correct?
Bali, sure.
I just want to bring that in because it's such a popular tourist spot now, and I think it's important to raise up that history.
All right. So, Indonesia being an archipelago, it starts in Java.
Right.
The killings spread to the west, and they move to the east. And then they keep going into the smaller islands, one of which is Bali. Bali has the highest death toll relative to population of any of the places in Indonesia during the anti-communist killings. At least 5% of the population were killed. That's how, because it was a lot of plantation workers there. And so their program of land reform was quite popular. And so, yeah, it's estimated that at least 5% of Bali's population were killed. And the mass graves.
Oh,
no, go ahead,
no,
Bob.
go ahead. I'm sorry.
The mass graves are spread out around Bali. Many of them are believed to be underneath where the big tourist resorts now are. And all of that's been erased from history in a very interesting manner. So let me go through the effects of the killings, because the killings are the killings and we've got to see what actually happened. There's the what and then the so what. So there's the mass killings, perhaps 3 million people killed, at least 500,000 people killed, maybe a number of people disappeared. Political prisoners who were not killed were then transported to a remote island called Buru Island. And Indonesia's greatest novelist, a man called Pramodia Anantatur, writes his quartet, the Buru Quartet, as a political prisoner on Buru Island, which tells the story of Indonesia, reimagines the entire story of Indonesia in novelistic forms. It's regarded as one of the greatest works of world literature in the 20th century. Anyway, the forced depoliticization of Indonesian society began. They got a historian, gave him the rank of brigadier general. His name was Nugroho Noto Susanto. And along with an American Rand Corporation Indonesianist called Guy Pawker, Pawker, they rewrite the entire Indonesian history curriculum. Okay, from the very beginning all the way to high school and a couple of universities that existed at the time. There weren't too many. And they remove ordinary Indonesians from the picture of the independence struggle. By removing ordinary Indonesians, you're removing the Indonesian Nationalist Party activists, you're removing the Indonesian Communist Party activists, and you're portraying it as entirely an Indonesian army affair. That it was only the Indonesian army that struggled against the Dutch. And then when the Japanese were surrendered as well, it's only the Indonesian army that actually truly defended Indonesia. There were conservative intellectuals who were then promoted and given advancement, and progressive intellectuals, progressive culture, films, novels, all of those were banned. And the writers and the creators then were placed on, either killed or put in that remote island I told you about, Buru Island. In every village in Indonesia, residents needed to obtain a letter of clean circumstances. I'm giving you the English language translation. A letter of clean circumstances. And they had to show that letter of clean circumstances to the army in order to get jobs, in order to have any kind of freedom inside Indonesia. The letter of clean circumstances meant that you could prove that you had no connection to the communists. And as a result, today, Indonesia is, I think, probably the only country in Southeast Asia that has no left wing. No left party and no left wing. And it's for these reasons, it's also an extremely unequal, oligarchical, kind of dominated country that is now trying to achieve some economic growth by allowing its resources and its environment to be plundered to create nickel, copper, and other things for the green energy transition.
Palm
as
oil,
they call
a lot
it.
of palm oil.
Yeah, all of those things, yeah. But also, the top academic studies on Indonesia does not occur in Indonesia. It occurs elsewhere. Australia is a center for Indonesian studies. The United States, Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, remains, an important place. Leiden University in the Netherlands, yes. Indonesia itself, nope. And that's because it's a consequence of what happens when you eliminate, either by removing the brains, blowing out the brains of the intellectual class, the educated class, or by imprisoning them and by censoring them and by forcibly depoliticizing the population. And the ideology became what they call massa manggamban, floating mass. Massa is mass, manggamban is floating mass, meaning the population themselves, the ordinary Indonesians, they don't have any politics. And their role is they should not have any politics. Rather, they are a floating mass. And we at the top, we will decide the developmental strategy for the country. it became called, outsiders called it repressive developmentalism. We'll decide the developmental thing, and you guys are required to then just implement it. Work in the fields, work in the mines, work in the factories, work wherever. And then every 5 years, we'll have a festival of democracy, call it an election. But the political parties, their programs, their membership lists, all of that is vetted by the Indonesian government, which basically means the Indonesian army. The governors, there are 26 provinces, and until Indonesia invaded East Timor, the 27 provinces, 26 provinces, the governors of them were not elected. They were appointed by the central government, and they were all generals. And the entire, almost the entire leadership of the Indonesian government were generals. There were, of course, technocratic economists, sometimes called the Berkeley Mafia, who were brought in to try and reform Indonesian society, to take away its nationalist element and make it more subordinate to foreign corporations, okay, in order to make its plantations available for export to earn dollars, things like that. And they were also
This is the modernization era, right? This is part of that whole modernization program, yeah.
Yeah, so it was the modernization theory in the United States was that you would need to have repressive developmentalist states in order to bring people and help them modernize. By a coincidence, these repressive developmental states would have no nationalism inside them and would be absolutely preferring the interests of the United States and its major corporations. So that was the other side to it. So what you've got then is Indonesia is ruled by people who view psychological operations, massacres, disappearances, executions as a normal part of statecraft, a normal part of government. Aid to Indonesia then increased in that repressive developmentalist idea. But the key thing about it was Indonesia, and not Vietnam, was the most important country in Southeast Asia, simply because of its size, its geographic size, its population size, its soft power in the third world. And so once the massacres were underway, there was a celebration in the West. The Australian Prime Minister said that with 800,000 communists knocked off, I think it is safe to say that a reorientation has occurred. The New York Times correspondent, a man called James Reston, referred to a gleam of light in Asia. Another newspaper talked about hope where previously there was none. And it had there were interesting internal discussions in the United States at the time. Should we continue the Vietnam War? Because the whole point of the Vietnam War, was to crush these independent economic developments in Southeast Asia. So if the most important country has already succumbed, has already fallen to your forces, why do you need to keep going with Vietnam? And you guys would be able to enlighten us more than I can about what that meant. But we have internal things which I've quoted in the past about McGeorge Bundy, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, saying that, well, our efforts in Vietnam were no longer needed, perhaps, after the Indonesian killings. Do you have anything to say about that, guys?
They're clearly connected, right? But 1965 is also a year when the United States is escalating the war. It deploys combat troops in March, and then in July, it makes this commitment to send 225,000 more troops there. So it always saw that as part of this kind of larger movement. That goes back there. They'll even refer to Bandung in 1965. They'll talk about the spirit of Bandung or Bandungism or Sukarnoism or something like that. So it fits that same framework. My understanding was that Bundy, after the fact, said we could have ended the war after Indonesia. Yes. So I'm not sure in the stuff I've seen, I didn't see like anybody make that as a kind of legitimate proposal, because other than the guys in the generals, the guys in the U.S. military saying we don't need to be there. But
no, I wasn't implying that was part of the contemporary.
But I know definitely after the fact. Like I said, I told you, like I heard that from Noam. He's the first person who brought that up that I heard it from. But I mean, it's like the U.S. sees this is because it's also bombing, so-called secret bombing at that point in Cambodia and in Laos. It's subverting a bunch of all over the world, but especially in the Middle East. But Indonesia, ironically, is the place where it becomes the bloodiest. And a lot of the left in other parts of Asia actually criticized the PKI for not having a military wing associated with it at that time.
Yes, there is a rediscovery of some of the left ideas. What happens is there are international human rights campaigns to free these political prisoners.
Yeah.
And by the late 1970s, early 1980s, that has occurred. And there's a forcible depoliticization of the society. That's 1965, 66 onwards. There were student uprisings a decade later, which were crushed. And in the late 1970s, 79, there was another student uprising, which was also crushed. And some of these student leaders began to think, why is it that we keep losing? That coincides with the release of these political prisoners. And for the first time, some of Pramodia Anantato's novels begin to become available in a samizdat form, in an underground type of form. And as a result, a new generation, a small group of people, but a new generation of student activists and leaders, they rediscover the Indonesian left, Pramodia. And they then rediscover the poets and the playwright, the guy called Rendra, Rendra. And a lot of the cultural legacy of the Indonesian Communist Party and the spirit of the 50s and the 60s is rediscovered through those novels, those plays, those poems. And what these student leaders realize is that these people are not devils. They always thought of them as devils, diabolical, who were having these orgies and things like that. And they realize these people are actually Indonesian patriots. They are not devils at all. And slowly, that spirit of that 50s and 60s begins to come into the consciousness of younger and younger people in Indonesia, which culminates in the late 1990s with the overthrow of Suharto. And those ideas begin to be rediscovered, although at the organizational level, that does not occur. There is no left party in Indonesia, not at the mass level anyway.
Just thinking about today, last year, someone who was actually part of these circles as well became President Prabowo, who was a general and I think a junior officer, at least during the 70s, like during the invasion of Timor.
Yes.
But we're also seeing, similar to what maybe we saw in the late 90s, we're seeing a level of unrest and uprisings with street movements, youth movements. And I'm wondering, would you say that consciousness has moved there? I know it's around corruption and standard of living and things like that, but is this the same sort of spirit that we're seeing now that we saw in the late 90s, for example?
Excellent question. Look, in the 1990s, as I said, there was some student activists that had been informed by Pramodia's work and Rendra's work and progressive ideas and radical ideas. And they, along with urban workers during the Asian financial crisis, as well as farmers, mobilized in these protests, and that resulted in the resignation of President Suharto. This is under conditions of serious austerity during the Asian financial crisis, whereby the student activists were able to connect with the factory workers and the farmers, because the price of fertilizer had gone up, the price of cooking oil had gone up, the price of rice, all of those things had gone up. There were 9 essential commodities which were critical to social peace, and the price of them had gone up during the Asian financial crisis. What that did is it psychologically broke the confidence of the Indonesian military that they could just stop protests. And it empowered people to come out into the streets, to the point where a few years later, as the World Wide Web began to come on board, there began to be notifications by the Indonesian police saying protests are now scheduled for this. So even if somebody had lost an election and they were corrupt and they wanted to fight against having lost the election, they would mobilize their own supporters to have a protest. So the idea of
January
protests,
6th.
well, the idea of protests became normalized in Indonesia as a result of the fall of Suharto on the 21st of May, 1998. Yeah, it became the armed forces had lost their ability their psychological confidence had been shattered. They realized they could no longer keep the lid on things. And so everybody's protesting. But these are localized protests against localized temporary injustices. There might be some river gets polluted, so that people will mobilize for a protest. It might be some project has not been finished, traffic jams, there'll be a protest. So that is occurring. But we're not talking about a unified, cohesive group of people across the archipelago that come there with an economic program, wage increases, or anything like that. There's no coordinated political program. There are rather responses to localized temporary injustices. That's not the same as a movement. But when we talk about a movement, we're talking about coordinated activities across archipelagos with an organizational structure, some kind of a little wheel inside the bigger wheel that provides you with regular meetings. There's nothing like that. There are individual groups that might have concerns, but there's no movement as such. And all of that is a result of the 1965 killings. And Indonesia's national development, economic, political, cultural, intellectual, remains held back as a result of the counter-revolution that occurred in the 1960s.
I'm curious, how do, in Australia, in where you are now, how do they, or let's just say left scholars, let's restrict it to that, how do they look at this? Because in the US, obviously there's a vast new left literature and a lot of it deals with foreign policy. But Indonesia, I learned about it from Kayan and Red Rusa and others refer to it. I remember in the 80s, I think Kolko put out, maybe it was Confronting the Third World, and he talked about this. And liberals came after him. A lot of liberals were just pissed off because he said 1 million people were killed with American complicity. And I just wondered, Americans would talk about Vietnam and Cuba, but not so much Indonesia, the American left. Is in Australia, is this kind of more vibrant? Is this a bigger part of left intellectual?
No, look, firstly, I don't know what that left word means anymore, of course. But at the university...
Let's say anti-imperialists or however.
Sure. At the university level, there is valuable work done in translating the memoirs of what occurred, of the people who survived, the people who died, if they had any papers. There are biographies, there are studies done on the rewriting of the Indonesian curriculum that I described earlier by Guy Porker and Nugroho Suharto. There are definitely attempts to study the Indonesian killings. And it's not just left. It's just Indonesian studies in Australia isn't as big as it used to be, but it's still widespread enough that it's not limited to any particular political side of Australian politics. It just happens to happen, you just do it as part of the university. The problem is that so little written evidence was preserved in Indonesia itself as a result of the imposed amnesia on that society. But yes, there are, in fact, I've got books just up there, very good translations. They are done at Monash University, for example. There is the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, which publishes stuff. You've talked about John Russo, he's excellent. Jeffrey Robinson. Vanessa Heerman, Hearman, has done some important work, continues to do that. And there are many, I don't want to name, because there
were also a couple of pretty popular documentaries, not in the past decade. I think one maybe won an Academy Award or something like that.
Yes. So I haven't seen that, but it's called The Act of Killing.
It's bizarre. It's very surreal. It's very weird.
I see. I'm not really,
I think it's depoliticized because they're talking to people and one guy's wearing a dress and it's bleak as hell, but I don't think it's that political. It's weird. It's more like a dysfunction than political movement. It's weird to me.
Yeah, it's probably a limitation of my own intellectual limitations. And so I'm not really familiar with artistic representations of real events.
I get that.
Historical novels, apart from someone like Go Vidal, I generally try not to read because it's difficult enough for me to actually read up on actual serious professional historians that I haven't got time for the other stuff. But yes, that had an important effect because it brought to global attention the events of 1965. Joshua Oppenheimer's documentary, I haven't seen it, but it reached an audience that otherwise would not have read the kind of things that I'd read or that you read.
This is not, even on American, let's call them anti-imperial rather than left circles, Indonesia's not really a talking point. Like when I used to lecture more, I would talk mostly, like everybody else, I talk about Vietnam, Cuba, whatever, Nicaragua later. And I would throw Indonesia in there because it's important. You talk about that in class. When I taught, I would mention Indonesia. But even among American left or anti-imperialists, it's not an important talking point, which has always struck me because it's such a bloody example, one of the worst, really, of that entire era.
And Indonesia is going to remain and actually increase its importance on the global chessboard with the rise of China, because it is the most influential country in Southeast Asia, arguably alongside Singapore, which is much smaller, but Singapore because of its wealth and its financial status and so on. punches above its weight. But Indonesia is really the southern anchor of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. It had 10 members, it's just had an 11th. Timor-Leste has joined it. ASEAN's centrality, when they negotiate between the United States and China as a whole, what Indonesia says and does is actually very important. But you're right, it's mostly where American soldiers have fallen in battle that American scholarship or progressives talk about, because they don't really know about Indonesia, although the United States and its covert diplomacy played a huge role in the events in Indonesia.
Oh, absolutely.
But they usually focus more on Vietnam. In fact, less on Laos and Cambodia. And in fact, the most intensive bombing in history occurred in Laos.
Yeah.
And because no American soldiers fell there, it's missing from American popular consciousness as well. It's Vietnam that's done. And even there, often you find the moral calculus is how much our boys and girls suffered, not the consequences for those on the receiving end of imperial violence.
Yeah. One thing I'm curious about, as far as like Australian popular consciousness goes, where does Indonesia rate? Australia's in troops to Vietnam, but it's Indonesia and Timor are both like much more higher in the consciousness level amongst Australians.
Oh yeah,
right?
They're right next door to us.
Yeah,
Australian servicemen who fought in the Indonesian archipelago during the Second World War were absolutely committed to Indonesian independence before the Australian government even. The Australian government at the time was wavering because when Japan surrendered in the Second World War, the Dutch wanted to go back to their former colony and recolonize it. Britain had sent its troops, which actually many of them were Indians, as in from the country of India, not Native Americans, Indians, to fight against Indonesian nationalist forces. And there was fanatical resistance from Indonesian forces at the Battle of Surabaya, which has gone down in Indonesian history, and they mostly fought against British, i.e. British and Indian forces. But Australian servicemen had formed close ties with ordinary Indonesians during the Second World War. And so when Japan surrendered, there was a powerful movement inside Australia amongst returned service people, among church people, progressives, even conservatives who were quite fond of their Indonesian counterparts in the Second World War, committed to supporting Indonesian independence. The Australian government actually took a lead role in its diplomacy, trying to push the Dutch out and allow Indonesia to become independent. For one, they feared the growth of the Indonesian Communist Party. They didn't do that. But secondly, they also believed that the era of European colonization was coming to an end. That they would need, as that famous line in The Leopard, the Baron of Lampedusa says, if things are going to remain the same, everything has to change. And so they encouraged the Indonesian nationalists as a bulwark against the Indonesian communists, but also because they felt we can't really have the Dutch in Indonesia anymore. We just have to deal with the Indonesians.
There are plenty of Americans who thought the same about France returning to Indochina. There are plenty of the American, even like FDR and Truman, tried to discourage the French from going back for that same reason. Ho Chi Minh famously said, the day of the white man in Asia is near an end. And he also said, I'd rather sniff French shit for another 5 years than eat Chinese shit for the next 1,000.
Yeah. In fact, the Pentagon Papers, the most important part of the Pentagon Papers isn't the lies in the 60s that how the war is going badly when it's really not going well, when it's really going badly, but rather how it started, how the United States actually began to support the French presence in Indochina. The famous, I think, the 1st of May 1950 document in the Pentagon Papers about why Truman decides to back the French with the $10 million loan and all of those things. Yeah, it's a start. But yeah, the sense was that the era of Dutch colonialism was fading. And also, the Indonesian army had shown that it was not communist by crushing that rebellion in 1948 in Madiun in Central Java that we started the program with. So as a result, they were regarded as okay. Sukarno and company were regarded as okay. The problem was that Indonesia's serious needs for infrastructure, for development, for land reform, just for eliminating hunger, could not be solved under simple nationalist programs. There had to be some kind of social element to it. There had to be a redistributive element to it, as a result of which the Socialist Party of Indonesia, the left wing of the Indonesian Nationalist Party, and yes, the Indonesian Communist Party, they grew in prestige because they were offering solutions that preserved the existing structure. It was not revolutionary, but were more social democratic than what was on offer from the other parties. And of course, that was a big problem because it might inspire other forces elsewhere in the world.
We could talk about this for hours, but this has gone on quite a bit. I don't know if Scott has anything specific. It's 60 years. The only thing I would add, it's 60 years now. This is not at the forefront of our historical memory. Why do you
No.
think it's important to keep this historical narrative alive?
Okay, in my view, it's important not as a museum piece that one should somehow pay tribute to fallen people or whoever. For those who are committed to a communist route, perhaps they would feel that. I'm thinking about its relevance today in terms of its strategic importance today, its economic importance today. Indonesia remains a major country in global affairs. It remains the fourth most populous country in the world, the largest Muslim majority country in the world, an important player in Southeast Asia, an important player in the global non-aligned movement, an important player in the Group of 77, the Global South. And as people start talking about the importance of BRICS, you get more and more developing countries that want to affiliate with that organization. But the original program of the Indonesian Communist Party, the social democratic nature of it, the crushing of that program, its physical elimination, both culturally, intellectually, bodily, materially, means that what they have to offer and the road not taken remains a road that can be taken, and therefore remains of critical importance for the rest of this decade and beyond. It is not simply a matter of commemorating something on the anniversary 60 years ago. Rather, it is to show what mass mobilization looks like, what an empowered citizenry looks like, what people who feel that they should play an active role in their society looks like, as opposed to what Indonesia was turned into, namely a floating mass of people whose only role was to implement the top-down policies of an oligarchic, corrupt government. That's the importance of remembering the killings of 65. It's not simply a historical curiosity.
Well, normally I'm skeptical of that, but one thing that's really struck me is how within really 2 years, Americans suddenly very rapidly learned the history of Palestine. People, many of us, all three of us, have talked about this for a long time, and people just ignored us or called us anti-Semitic or whatever. And now it's like a majority view of Americans. They're starting to realize that this didn't start in 2023, that the Nakba was 80 years ago, almost 80 years ago. And so it's really striking how I've never seen such a rapid transformation of a historical period like I've seen with regard to Palestine. So yeah, you have to keep these things alive.
The struggle for dignity is in everyone. And Americans, and Indonesians, everyone. That fight for dignity, which is what the Indonesian Communist Party represented, material dignity, ideological dignity, your identity, cultural dignity, that is true of Americans. And in fact, your own president is a political giant in the United States because he's able to touch and harness the identity of Americans in a way that was neglected and shown contempt for by democratic politicians of the past. Of course, he's doing it in a way that actually advances the interests of the
and Republican presidents of the past too, really.
And Republican presidents, yeah. And so identity, there is twin pillars of politics are interests and identity. They are, one does not simply arise from the other like a superstructure or anything like that. Rather, they both arise. The former arises because of our legacy as being part of the species of Homo sapiens. We have a sense of ourselves in the world, a story we tell ourselves that this place has, I am a valued part of this world. This is my place where I have meaning in my life. It's a system of meaning as much as a system of belief. And that identity is what the Indonesian Communist Party represented, and progressive forces in Indonesia, and any Americans who wish to have sympathy for or solidarity with those forces in Indonesia today will need to understand that identity.
Just to Bob's point really quick, and partially this is because I work for an organization that works on Indonesian rainforest issues, and then around a lot of youth, let's call them Gen Z, is that I actually find, and I don't want to give Vincent Bevins credit for this, but I do find that a lot more people of that generation are much more aware of the history that we do know of from 1965 in Indonesia amongst American, at least activists and Gen Z age people. It's actually quite fascinating. And Palestine even ranks higher because all those kids know a lot about Palestine too. But it's interesting how many more of them are familiar with this history of what happened in Indonesia 60 years ago. So just want to throw that out
well,
there.
I'm glad you said
That's
that.
also partially why I wanted to do this episode too.
The thing with the Gen Z, just so you understand, the Gen Z, as we call them here, is...
Yeah, Gen Z, sorry.
It's totally fine. Look, we have already begun the Gen Z revolutions around the world. Okay, Nepal, Madagascar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Indonesia may be next, Timor-Leste as well. Youth around the world are realizing that there is an alternative to the way the world currently is, as it's presented to them. And the next wave will be for the next 5 years. Those questions will first and primarily be confronted by Gen Z activists around the world.
Right.
The task, therefore, becomes to allow the people in that generation, in your country and mine, to regard the people in the developing world not as hostiles who are going to invade them, but as people who want dignity just as they do. And those outbreaks of democracy that have occurred in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, etc., are, in my view, harbingers of what's coming for the rest of this decade, namely a new, younger generation of human beings who are protesting about localized, temporary problems that they themselves face. The task is to get to see them and see themselves as part of a global wave where they have much in common. Firstly, around the world, but also in their own country. That it's not just a local event, but rather they have much in common with people their age in the next city and in the next continent.
Yep. So folks, we've been talking with Dr. Clinton Fernandes, professor at University of New South Wales in Canberra, talking about the 60th anniversary of the killings and massacre, genocide in Indonesia. If you like what you're hearing, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and Blue Sky. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. And if you really like us, give us a donation at greenandredpodcast.org and by hitting that support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And until then, everybody out there, make trouble and misbehave, and we'll talk to you again soon.